This is a production of Cornell University.
Well, thank you very much, Andy, and thanks for being here. We're going to learn what I've been doing these past few years, all related to agricultural residue burning in Eastern India. But first, do you know someone with one of these? An iPhone. Might even be you. And if you have an iPhone, I don't. I have a cracked screen Android. But if you have an iPhone, the likelihood that you have a Mac computer, your finances might be integrated into Apple Pay, or even have a Apple Watch makes it really difficult if a better technology comes on board, whether it's related to price, longevity, camera, and Android. But anyway, I won't go into phone politics there, but this is something that we call technological lock-in. And what technological lock-in is it makes it difficult to transition out of something that you're already in. And there are some examples in agriculture as well. So a really classic example in agriculture is John Deere equipment and the integrated software platform. So once that farmer takes this big capital investment into the tractor and has their whole data systems and data management integrated, it makes it really difficult to switch brands. But we can even extend this definition to the context of crop residue burning. Crop residue burning in rice systems in India is a practice that allows farmers to quickly remove the residue of rice once the grain is harvested to quickly plant in the subsequent crop of wheat. And this practice replaces the traditional practice of manually harvesting, bundling the straw and carrying it back into the homestead for livestock uses and other uses. And here's the lock-in part, that once farmers adopt burning, it makes it very difficult for them to transition, usually on a more of an economic reason, into something like a baler or a happy seeder, which is a instrument or a mechanism that picks up the residue and allows farmers to plant wheat into the heavy residue load. And so it makes it very difficult. So to give you a little bit more context of the problem of burning, the main hotspot of burning in India happens in the northwest, in Punjab and Haryana. Every year, unfortunately, there's a major winter air quality crisis in the city of Delhi. And it's gotten a lot of attention for good reason. Now, if you look at the satellite data and take a look at where our area of work is in Bihar state in the east, the density burning isn't as frequent, but what's alarming and why we're interested in studying this is because the rate of burning is increasing rapidly over the last 2 decades. Now, burning has long-term implications for nutrient availability in the soil, but the major issue with residue burning is the air pollution. So in a very simple sense, the particulate matter, particularly the particulate matter of 2.5 microns or less, causes major health issues. And so in Delhi, in the peak burning season, the air pollution, almost 42% on average, is coming from burning, which is really a massive amount. And if we look at some of the worst polluted cities in India, we see, of course, Delhi listed up there towards the top, but Patna, the largest city in Bihar, the capital city, is right next to it. And that's without all the additional burning and the pollution from the burning. And so in the Northwest, it's been a pervasive problem. Even though government has made regulation, put investments into equipment, it's been really difficult to stop and get farmers transitioned out of it. They're essentially locked in. And so for us, it's an opportunity to get ahead of this problem and prevent the lock-in situation in the East. And so my research can be grouped into 3 main bundles. First, we want to know what is happening. So far, burning in East India has been understudied. And so we want to know what's been happening across space and time. And then why? Why is burning on the rise? And finally, if we're not burning it, now what? We need to look at other pathways. And all of these pieces are meant to inform policy design. and get ahead of the impending issue. So we'll start with the what. So we're looking at what has happened in Bihar across space and time since 2002. That's the earliest that we have satellite information, or that we're using satellite information-wise, so to see what's been happening related to burning. But we also, the next two components of this work are related to understanding what would happen mid-century if business as usual continued. And then look at that scenario as well as a couple other scenarios to simulate air quality outcomes. Sure, if it increases, what does that actually mean for public health? It puts some real meaning and some real urgency behind things. And that was done with our atmospheric sciences collaborators using transport modeling to model implications for public health burden. The methods use two main satellite products, MODIS and VIIRS. MODIS has a longer time series since 2002, but a fairly coarse resolution at 1 kilometer, whereas VIIRS has a shorter time series. We can't look back as far, but it has a finer spatial resolution, and so it's capturing more fires. And then those two data sets are used with ground observations and relate to what that means for emission-wise, particularly for air pollution. So our first step is quantify fires over space and time, and then the second step is then to estimate the impacts mid-century. So results show, just from a visual observation, I know the font's a little small in the back, but from 2012, 15, 18, not only are we seeing fires increasing in the Southwest, but we're also seeing fires spreading across to the east spatially. When we look at this quantitatively across time, in the gray, the x-axis, we have the years, and on the y-axis, we have the burn area. And in the gray, we can see that from our historic knowledge of fires and what we're seeing from the satellite data, that fires are nearly doubling. We're also seeing this very interesting pattern, probably see it, this up-down, this kind of extreme interannual variability. So not only are they increasing, they have this interesting nature about them. So we did some empirical modeling to say what that could look like mid-century if business as usual continues. And these fires from 2020 to 2050, we're looking at potentially 142% increase. But now we want to see what that means for public health and air pollution. So this is our scenario analysis, and we looked at three main scenarios. Ideally, all the burning that has taken place up to now, we want to stop. All right, that's like present day levels. Of course, we'd love to stop everything, but let's say we just no more progression. The levels that they're at right now, let's keep them there. That was our first scenario. Second scenario reflects back to the previous slide, that increase. And then the Northwest analog is something that we'd like to compare the area of burn to what is happening in the Northwest. So if burning got as bad on an area basis as Punjab and Haryana, what would that mean for air quality? And I'll draw your attention to those three circled there, those three main scenarios. And we're looking at this, the way we look at this is in exceedance days. So we look at pollution thresholds, PM 2.5, and we look at two different thresholds. We have the World Health Organization, which has a more conservative value on what's exceedance for PM 2.5, and then the Indian National Air Quality Standard. And when we look at the number of exceedance days just for burning alone, so this is not traffic, this is not industrial, this is burning alone, that we can see in the Northwest analog, there's up to 45 days exceedance, again, out of 92 within the 3-month period, that are expected to be 42 days or almost 45 days above that threshold. Now, we looked at a couple other things as well, and I'll just give you a little glimpse on some of the other things we looked at. And also, I think this model has a really cool output with the lines there. So what this is a 5-day back trajectory of winds. So we know the winds are going to carry these pollutants and making acute air pollution events more prevalent. And we also know that the location of the burns in Bihar in the southwest are fairly close proximity to the main city. So depending on the air condition, the wind conditions, for example, the winds, it can cause some pretty big issues and acute events in the city. So it's not just about these overall averages, but it's also these like really bad days, depending on what other conditions are adding to the issue and carrying those pollutants. So the key message to this first piece of the work is burning is in fact on the rise, unfortunately. And burning at present levels can be easily overlooked. But if creative and urgent policy interventions are not implemented, it could result in a mid-century air quality crisis, particularly during the winter months. But from this work, this is something that we call a naive analysis. So we're really interested in the point pattern process, how that's moving across space and time. It doesn't give us any insight into why. And that's what leads us into the next piece, the why. We want to know the drivers of burning. Why? Where is this residue going, particularly related to burning? And what are the drivers at the household and across the landscape? And then here's the tricky part. Well, that's tricky as well. But here's the tricky part is, okay, we're in a system in Bihar that is developing. There's structural transformation taking place. There are system changes related to labor and livestock that are going to be influencing the systems. So it's not only important for us to understand what the drivers are and identify them, but understand how they relate and the order and the sequence of change in the system. And that will hopefully give us some much deeper understanding of where certain policy interventions could be targeted. So to begin to understand this complex system, we used a very detailed interaction model or description here. And please don't attempt to read this because you might get a little headache, but I'll walk you through some major components here. The first thing we're seeing related to burning is labor changes. If you look at the farmer there bundling the straw, this is the traditional way of handling these residues. These residues are manually harvested, bundled, carried back to the homestead. It's very labor intensive. And as labor is becoming more expensive or less readily available, or labor in the household, the amount of available individuals in the household to do agricultural labor is decreasing, it opens the need for mechanized options, which is the main one here is the combine harvester. Although there's some other intermediary mechanization options as well, such as the reaper. But the combine harvester is the big one. But here's the issue with the combine harvester. Instead of having these nice long stalks that are easy to store, that the livestock enjoy, that's a held perception. The combine takes the whole plant, threshes it, chops it up, throws it out the back. And so these residues are now shorter, bent, more difficult to pick up. And so it's just a lot more difficult to handle, and the quality is down. And then livestock. So in these systems, the crop and livestock systems are quite intertwined. So one of our initial hypotheses was perhaps these systems are decoupling a bit at the household. And so you have these areas of deficit and surplus for the residue. Potentially, livestock numbers are going down, so there's an overall more of a deficit or a surplus, for residues. The one thing with why we're studying this issue in the East as well, and I'll just take a side note here, is in the Northwest. It's a major issue, and there's been a lot of studies to try to understand the drivers in the Northwest, and it's highly related to the combine use. But in these systems, the farm sizes are smaller. The combine can't get into all the fields because the fields are fragmented. It's wetter, like the machine can't get in on time as well. And so there's these dynamics that make this ecology different, and why you need to take a deeper look at it. And then there's agronomy issues too, with changing climates, potentially different types of varieties. We have a shorter window to harvest harvest the rice and then plant the wheat. So there's all these aspects we're looking at and considering. And to do this was a true mixed method study. Mixed methods meaning both quantitative and qualitative. So right before the pandemic, we didn't know the pandemic was coming. We were in the field talking with key informants, farmers, as a very preliminary understanding to develop our household surveys. We also have our partners in country, CIMMYT, CISA, who have been collecting what is called a crop diagnostic survey. So we have some type of idea of what the typical management, yields, and so forth are in the region. And these were used to inform our quantitative survey, the crop residue burning survey, which then added some additional components, so related to labor, livestock, right? All those things, residue markets that I had mentioned earlier. We did it twice. The second one was informed by the results and findings of the first, so further refined. And then ultimately we used the second survey with 475 respondents for our random forest, and then coupled that with the remotely sensed data. And then for the qualitative piece, we went into one specific district in Buxar. Buxar is an area, you can see that in orange there, an area where burning is prevalent and the combine is available. So not everywhere in this state is the combine even available. So we wanted to make sure we had all the possible factors. And something that was really interesting is there are some people who are using the combine but not burning. Why are they not burning? Like, that's a really important thing that's happening that we don't really understand, and we needed to at least get some more insight into that. So these were semi-structured interviews, 18 households. The male and female head of household were interviewed by female interviewers separately, and that was to get a sense of the decision-making process within the household. But let's take a look at the quantitative. So then quantitatively, for the random forest, a series of predictor variables were selected. These were, again, related to livestock, related to household number of individuals in the household, the market integration of that household. For example, the amount of ag income share of the household, integration into the residue market. Are they selling residues? Are they buying residues for their livestock? And so forth. And then, of course, this was aimed at trying to understand our target variable, farmer reported burning. Now, as all good researchers as we are, we realize that things don't always happen the way we want them to. And in fact, we oversampled so that we would have a population of burners, or those farmers who have burned in the past. We only actually had 5 respondents in that last survey that admitted to burning. This is for a couple of reasons. One, well, it's a trust reason, essentially. So the government of Bihar has made no burn regulation, and there has been some efforts on enforcement. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But essentially, these households were nervous about admitting to burning and potentially having punitive pressure. But we know through remote sensing and, more importantly, conversations with people on the ground, that burning is quite prevalent in some of these areas. And so then we had to go back to our remotely sensed data. And it's difficult to study fires. And I showed you this plot earlier. And the reality is this plot, while that has, a few fires on it, it's missing potentially up to 75% of the small fires. Right? So we kind of know what's happening. We can it gives us a representative idea across time of the trends, but it's hard to say that household burnt. And this is because these fires are small. They last half hour. These satellite, depending on the instrument, there might be only 2 or 4 passes a day, and they're also crossing over in a season where there's more haze and there's more clouds, and so there's a lot of omissions in these observations. So we did an exercise using a combination of satellite products, using spatial analysis, using a smoothing exercise, kernel density estimation to create a burn likelihood. So based on where that household is located within the state, it's given a value on a scale of 1 to 0, burn being more likely at a 1. And then we paired this with the GPS point of the household surveys to at least give us some type of connection and gap fill a little bit of this error. So instead of the farmer reported burning for our target variable, which would have been ideal, we then use the satellite derived burn likelihood value. So it's just a way to gap fill and get a little creative, I guess, there. So for the random forest results, our model explained 32% of the variance. The model explained 32%, which is fairly low. And considering our target, how we came up with our target value, we also know that we're probably missing some things that are happening in the landscape that weren't included as predictors in our model. But I have one single regression tree. Remember, random forest has multiple trees. That this is one example of how the model is thinking about these factors. So our first split is for farmers with more than 10% of their rice area combine harvested. They're more likely to burn. And I'll just note that a lot of these farmers, the combine use versus manual use is usually not a binary. It's usually a percentage of each. Again, it depends on the timing, on the availability, on the entry in the field entry and livestock. So the second split here is with livestock. So as livestock, as the household had more livestock, a higher density, they were less likely to burn, giving insight that livestock would give that farmers were choosing to manually harvest potentially or with more livestock. But we can also look at this with the variable importance plot. Again, you can see that combine livestock rise to the top, but I'll show you, I want your attention to go to that third variable there, harvest date. On the right, we're looking at partial dependency plot. So we want to see how harvest date relates to burn likelihood on the y-axis. And what's interesting is we see this very clear ledge here. This ledge saying that once that farmer gets to a certain harvest date, so a late harvest of rice, there's a real urgency to remove that residue and get the wheat in. Farmers are very aware that their wheat yields and profitability are dependent on getting the wheat planted in on time. So I think this is something that is quite variable year to year, and something that is something that should be considered in this decision. Now, this quantitative work was useful. It gave us insights to the predictors. Although it did only explain a small amount of the variance. So we know there's some things missing and we need to do some further work. And that's why we went into the qualitative piece. As well as quantitatively, it's very difficult to understand the order of change processes. And so this is where the qualitative piece came in. So moving into step 2, this is some of our farmers that we're speaking with, along with our collaborator who's an anthropologist. But these systems are very complex, right? And so we really needed to figure out a framework that we could systematically look at farmers' decision-making. So we use this framework called the livelihoods platform approach, because farmers' decision-making at various levels, from the household, community, institution, are interdependent on the resources available, let it be human, physical, financial, informational. And so this gave us a framework to develop our semi-structured interviews, and then also create a code book and analyze the results in a very systematic way. So here's our results. And we're looking at the sequence of the drivers related to burning. We have labor and livestock coming up as as the initial changes in the system, which is interesting. I mean, our quantitative work didn't really capture the changes related to labor, but we saw this a lot more in our qualitative work. So for example, if labor was low in the household, or even if they wanted to hire labor to manually harvest their fields and it wasn't available for multiple reasons, they were more likely to adopt the combine. And we were seeing low labor and livestock at the household decreasing. Now, labor also relates to livestock, because if there's less household labor available, the likelihood that they're going to keep and tend the livestock goes down. And so while the other side of that is if there's high levels of livestock, more household labor in particular, the decision to manually harvest or the percentage of area manually harvested increases. And the harvest method is really key to determining the value of straw. Whereas if it's manually harvested, you have the straw maintaining value as a fodder or some other household purposes as well. But if it's combine harvested, the primary pathway is burning, that it's really viewed as a waste product unless it's fed by fodder, or fed as fodder, excuse me. We also asked farmers, okay, we have this problem, like what would your solution to burning be? Farmers really struggled to try to figure, many of them responding, there are no options. Like, we have no choice. This is our livelihood. We have to get our wheat planted on time. And we also, of course, captured the gender lens, the household decision-making process through all of this. I will show you some really interesting quotes came out of this work, but I'll point to this idea that it's difficult to solve these problems with policies for no burn and then trying to enforce no burn policies. We have respondents saying, we have no fear of anyone coming to enforce these rules. We can burn. This is my land, so I'm burning the straw on my land. Another respondent, the second one there, said, well, people in the community do burn, but there's great concern that they're going to have essentially punitive action against them. And then I think what's really interesting, this last sentence, government officers came here, but no one is ready to stop this process, this burning process. This respondent later inferred that oftentimes that enforcer is their buddy, like, right? Rural places, they have farming to do as well, but in the sense that they have residue to remove as well. And then also some community action where farmers will all burn at the same time and then meet the enforcer at one time, burn at night. So these things are difficult to enforce. So the key message is farmers don't have useful and accessible solutions and alternatives. And the best solution, and where we think there's an opportunity for policy intervention, is creating value around straw, to preserve the quality of straw, and think about how you use the system of changes to inform how straw could be valued. So with all this, remember, we want to facilitate no-burn pathways that, one, are responsive to the changing crop livestock system that the last component, the second piece just clarified. And we want to create value around straw. So the third piece looks at pathways forward. So imagine we have the rice residue and we can group the pathways into three main groups. We can burn it, we want to avoid that. We can handle that residue off the field, so remove it, feed it to livestock or other purposes, or we can keep it on the field and manage it in the field. And when we look at this from a labor perspective, that's often the easiest. And there is some additional value there potentially. So one, by keeping carbon in the soil or adding carbon to the soil, there's a potential for agronomic gains. Now, of course, this is complex in itself, and the study doesn't particularly dive too deep into that. What it does dive into is the potential greenhouse gas benefits of building carbon in the soil, and then potentially we're in the context and environment right now where there could be potentially carbon financing that could potentially be involved in this as well. But one thing in these systems is they're rice systems. Rice systems are generally wet systems, which then are more prone to methane, and the trade-offs of adding carbon into the systems becomes a little bit more complex. And that's what this third and last paper, body of work, I should say, looks at. It looks at various post-harvest residue pathways. I'm drying out. A lot of talking. And so it looks at various pathways, but specifically looks at in situ management and the effect of hydrology on carbon management in these systems, and then compares and contrasts all these pathways to more completely understand the conditional value of residue in these systems from the greenhouse gas perspective. All right, I'm going to share with you some field realities in Bihar related to hydrology. Now, I'll focus a little bit more on this aspect in today's presentation because it's often overlooked when we're looking at greenhouse gas accounting in these types of systems. So here is a dry, flooded, and saturated field situation. These are pipes where 30-centimeter pipes, there we go, where 15 centimeters above surface level, 15 centimeters below. And every day, measurements can be taken in that pipe to give us a sense of the water level in that field. Now, the thing with water is that it creates an anaerobic environment, which allows methane to be produced in that anaerobic environment. And in the most simple sense, we're adding carbon into the system, which is essentially giving more fuel to these microbes to then produce more methane. So that's the type of reality that we're trying to understand. Now in Bihar, a field might go through all of these in just a matter of a couple days. These are not irrigated systems, but we have lateral flow, we have precipitation, of course, and these are determined by soil properties, but also the position in the landscape as well. And in fact, our lab's looking into how to better characterize this. But for our general sense, this is kind of gives you a sense of what this field might look like. So 9 sites here, and this is just day by day in the field during the rice season. You can see sites 1 and 6 there, what we call flashy, dry, wet, dry, wet, dry, wet. And so when we're trying to calculate methane emissions in general, it's challenging, and we really can use things like dynamic models to understand these. These are very difficult scenarios and realities to try to create an experiment farm, for example. So this study looks at the different pathways, and it uses primarily tier 1 accounting approaches. So fairly basic standard coefficients to understand livestock pathways, in-field, off-field management. But with the soil component and the water component, we have an opportunity to dive a little bit deeper and compare that with tier 3 approaches. And so what we have here to work with is we want to understand carbon returns in the field under different hydrologies. So we have a data set 2020, whole distribution of flooded and dry. And we, on that distribution, selected a dry, median, and wet site. And that's our categories. But we know that there's a lot of interannual, these fields look very different in different climate years. So we actually have 3 years of data, and we did the same thing, picked it on a distribution. When we ran this model for 100 years, each year we would randomly select model year. We would randomly select a hydrology year. So for example, 2020 was a very wet year. And then 2022, you probably say that was like super dry drought year. And so not only are we wanting to see the methane differences and the net GHG balance of these different hydrologies, we want to get a sense of, be realistic in the fact that these are going to change year to year. So we had our hydrologies. We looked at the residue retention as a treatment, so 10% stubble only versus 100% residue return. And then we looked at yields as well, so current yields versus intensified or higher yields. So essentially, if you're returning more fresh carbon, that's going to matter, as well as more active biomass growing, you're going to have more methane released. So here's our results. We have the hydrologies grouped on the x-axis, and we have the cumulative seasonal average methane flux. In blue, we have no residue treatments, and in green, we have the residue treatments. And as we expected, wetter environments, median and wet there, have much higher methane overall, methane flux. But what's really interesting here is that when you add residues back into those systems, you have, in wetter environments, you have a much more range of possibilities, where if you add that residue into a drier environment, on a methane perspective, it's fairly negligible to the no residue treatment or the stubble only treatment. But the big question is, particularly from the carbon market standpoint, is, are we, by adding carbon into these systems, is there more of a net positive flux through methane and nitrous oxide as compared to building SOC, soil organic carbon? And where's that balance at? Ideally, we know that these options are better than burning. From a public health standpoint, that straw needs to go somewhere else. But if we're looking at these dry conditions, it's close to zero. That balance is close to zero in the first few years, but then it starts to increase into a net positive flux. And in the wetter environments, the flux is the net is much different. So the key message is that field hydrology has a controlling effect on methane in particular, and that when we're guiding farmers towards pathways, that we need to be very context specific and perhaps understand the landscape, place carbon in the drier environments, and just be very clear about the expected outcomes. Now, I will say these results are early. We're working on these results. And these are in systems where there's still tillage. We're looking to, it's following similar current farmer practices, what's actually doable right now. And these are tropical soils, right? So there's many factors at play, and I'm just giving you a glimpse of some of these comparisons, but it gets us thinking a little bit more about how complex these situations are. So in conclusion here, this work in totality helped describe what's happening in Bihar for the first time across space and time with burning, which was a really neat, I think, I'm a little biased, but I think was a very interesting perspective. We got a sense of the drivers of burning and how that relates to the change processes in the system. And then from a greenhouse gas standpoint, we're gaining a perspective of how these different pathways prepare, but still in the context of anything is better than burning, essentially, in the most simplest conclusion. But I would like to take a couple moments here to have a big picture reflection with you all. This research was an opportunity to get ahead of a problem. Oftentimes in agriculture, we're addressing big, hairy issues. And this was an opportunity to understand a problem while it's smaller or in its infancy, to hopefully understand it, to bend the trajectories, and to prevent something that's quite unsustainable at a very large level. And that might be something that you could think about for your own research as well. I think it's a very interesting, if we're really looking at making our ag systems more sustainable, it's a really interesting approach to take. But speaking of complex systems, Andy mentioned this earlier, this research really embraced multidisciplinary collaborations. I think it had to actually give the complexity of the system and to give it justice, to really pull apart all these complex pieces. And my background was in the social sciences, so I was a little bit keen on that, and I got really analytical really quick with my work, which was also good, stretched me quickly. But at the same time, like we know these collaborations are challenging. I worked very closely with atmospheric scientists here at Cornell, and then also our social scientist partner in country. And timelines vary. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer to have these conversations. Sometimes creative tension comes up in a good way, right? And it's best in the long term. But I think when we're working with these ag systems, we are in fact working with systems, and it's worth embracing that aspect. So with that, thank you very much. I have a special thank you. I want to say a special thank you to the Soil and Crops section faculty and staff. I know we're all running on passion and a little bit of pressure, and I just want to appreciate the time that you all have taken to talk to me about this work, other work, realities of sleepless nights with an infant. And I appreciate you taking your time out of your days and creating the supportive environment. So thank you.
Questions from the floor? They're officially 2 minutes, but I'm sure that Emily will stick around.
Thank you so much for nice presentations. I wonder about, are there any socio-ecological positive or negative effects of the regional burning on the people, local people, or animals or birds in the area?
Oh, so the question was, are there any effect of burning on the people? And you're thinking on people, animals in the area, you're thinking in addition to the pollution? Is that like the air?
Any socio-ecological effects of the positive or negative living in this area, local peoples and animals and birds in the area? Is there an effect, positive or negative?
That's an interesting perspective on wildlife. I've given very little thought of the wildlife, but if you're thinking of the animals around and the people around, I think, yeah, I think other than the pollution, you would imagine that pollution, the air quality would affect livestock as well, and the productivity of the farm animals around. As far as a livelihood strategy, it's a very quick way. You light a match, your problem of dealing with this massive residue load is gone. So because of that, it's easily adopted, but yeah, obviously we don't want that direction. So it's almost a benefit at the cost, right? Yeah, thank you. Did I see Ying? I think I saw your hand, yeah?
I have many questions, but first of all, fantastic talk, and that pushed me to think more like how we can help from the remote sensing perspective and also model perspective. So the first question is about related to your first project. So I wonder like how you build the model that between I think the fire emission that you utilize to extrapolate to the future. I think that model is super critical, but to me that's kind of like a black box at this point, right?
Yeah.
So that's my first question. And for the second question is for the third project, that you're utilizing models to look at the differences, right, among different scenarios. I wonder if that has been validated or with independent experiment to verify the differences among those different pathways are real, or to what degree that the magnitude differences is realistic or not.
Right. Okay, so those were two great questions. First was related to in the first paper, the emissions data sets was very critical to our final results and what's actually going on there. And the second question is related to the, my goodness, I'm blanking. But let me start with the first. First, with the emissions data set, we have, it's our partner, or not partners, a group at Harvard put together that data site, or that emissions data set that was the first effort. There are a couple different data sets that relate fires to emissions. And this was a data set that gap filled because a lot of those didn't include ground truthing and even this The building of that data set also included household surveys. This is before a lot of the no burn regulation came up, so farmers were admitting to burning in their study. And so we are trusting that that is the best emissions data source that we have from that group that has been heavily involved in burning in India. And then for your second question, the second question was related to, are we validating the results for DNDC and those questions there. And our lab group is at large looking to do that from the hydrology perspective, because at this point it is very challenging, like I said, to try to match. Those realities, those field realities, hydrologies that I showed you are all within a very small geographic area in Bihar. So it's just like the amount of variability is quite extreme. So that's part of what our lab group is looking to better characterize. But I will mention that as far as this modeling exercise, finding absolute terms, it's loose, but it does give us some idea of intercomparison between the treatments.
Great talk, Emily. Enjoyed it. I have a couple of questions. Do you relate the Bihar situation with Northwest India? And you mentioned about burning, continuous burning there. So there's a policy of planting those rice in Northwest India with the planting dates you have to go with. Is there such a state policy in Bihar that is implemented, and how that is affecting the burning aspect? And second question is, how the state agencies playing a role in educating the producers or the smallholding growers on this topic in the state of Bihar?
Agency, yeah, and the farmers. So the first question was that there's very strict regulation in the Northwest on planting times to keep the system in order in that way. I'm not familiar. Andy is there. Back me up on this. In Bihar, there's no such.
And that's because of the underground water decline. That's part of the whole complex policy.
Right.
I'm not sure in Bihar what's happening.
Not an issue in Bihar.
In Northwest, it's
Right.
Right. And Andy's done quite a bit of work looking at the groundwater aspect and relating that relationship. But in Bihar, no. Could it go that direction? Potentially.
And you mentioned about the happy cedar. How much is that being adopted in Bihar, or has it played a role?
Not common in Bihar, and part of it. Oh, Andy's on the edge of his seat. Wants to jump in. Gotta let the grad student talk. just being tough on you. But it is in Bihar. You're dealing with smaller field sizes that have had smaller. The mechanization, the tractors are much smaller, and the happy cedar is very horsepower, requires a lot of horsepower, and so there's a gap there. And then the amount of service providers within that small window, it's very limited. And yeah, the happy cedar has a huge, as you know, huge discussion in the Northwest about the economics and the timely accessibility to it and all of that. So it's complex. Did you want to jump in?
No,
Okay.
I'm mindful of time. We should thank Emily and give her one more round of applause. Thanks for coming, and Emily, if anybody has remaining questions, seek Emily out now and stick around a few more minutes.
Yep.
Of course.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.